Page 185, Chapter 10, Post-Colonial Criticism, Section Background, Para. Post-colonial criticism emerged as a distinct category only in the 1990s. It is not mentioned, for instance, in the first edition of Selden's Seldn', A Reader's Guide to Contemporary Literary Theory, 1985, or Jeremy Hawthorne's A Concise Glossary of Contemporary Literary Theory, 1992. It gained currency through the influence of such books as In Other Worlds, Gayatri Spivak, 1987, The Empire Writes Back, Bill Ashcroft, 1989, Nation and Narration, Homi Bhabha, 1990, and Culture and Imperialism, Edward Said, 1993. An important collection of relevant essays, though it does not use the term post-colonialism, is Race, RACE, Writing and Difference, 1986, reprinted from 2 issues of the journal Critical Inquiry and edited by Henry Louis Gates, Jr., one of the best-known American figures in this field. Para. One significant effect of post-colonial criticism is to further undermine the universalist claims once made on behalf of literature by liberal humanist critics. If we claim that great literature has a timeless and universal significance, we thereby denote or disregard cultural, social, regional, and national differences in experience and outlook, preferring instead to judge all literature by a single, supposedly universal standard. Thus, for instance, a routine claim about the Wessex, Wessex setting of Hardy's novels is that it is really a canvas on which Hardy depicts and examines fundamental universal aspects of the human condition. Thus, Hardy's books are not thought of as primarily regional or historical or masculine or white or working class novels. Page 186. They are just novels, and built into this attitude is the assumption that this way of writing and representing reality is the unquestioned norm, so that the situations depicted can stand for all possible forms of human interaction. This universalism is rejected by post-colonial criticism. Whenever a universal signification is claimed for a work, then white Eurocentric norms and practices are being promoted by a sleight of hand to this elevated status, and all others correspondingly relegated to subsidiary, marginalized roles. Para. The ancestry of post-colonial criticism can be traced to Franz F.R.A.N.T.Z. Fanon, F.A.N.O.N., Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, published in French in 1961, and voicing what might be called cultural resistance to France's African empire. Fanon, a psychiatrist from Martinique, argued that the first step for colonialized people in finding a voice and an identity is to reclaim their own past. For centuries, the European colonizing power will have devalued the nation's past, seeing its pre-colonial era as a pre-civilized limbo, or even as a historical void. Children, both black and white, will have been taught to see history, culture, and progress as beginning with the arrival of the Europeans. If the first step towards a post-colonial perspective is to reclaim one's own past, then the second is to begin to erode the colonialist ideology by which that past had been devalued. Para. Hence, another major book which can be said to inaugurate post-colonial criticism proper is Edward Said, S-A-I-D', Orientalism, 1978, which is a specific expose of the Eurocentric universalism, which takes for granted both the superiority of what is European or Western and the inferiority of what is not. Said identifies a European culture tradition of Orientalism, which is a particular and long-standing way of identifying the East as other, O-T-H-E-R within quote, and inferior to the West. The Orient, he says, features in the Western mind, quote, as a sort of surrogate and even underground self, unquote. Literature in the Modern World, edited Dennis Wilder, p. 236. This means, in effect, that the East becomes the repository or projection of those aspects of themselves which Westerners do not choose to acknowledge: cruelty, sensuality, decadence, laziness, and so on. At the same time, and paradoxically, the East is seen as a fascinating realm of the exotic, the mystical, and the seductive. It also tends to be seen as homogeneous, the people there being anonymous masses rather than individuals, their actions determined by instinctive emotions, lust, lust, terror, fury, etc., rather than, page 187, by conscious choices or decisions. Their emotions and reactions are always determined by racial considerations. They are like this because they are Asiatics or blacks or Orientals, rather than by aspects of individual status or circumstance, for instance, because they happen to be a sister or an uncle or a collector of antique pottery. As Syed says, after quoting the example of a colonial administrator's 1907 account of life in Damascus, quote, in such statements as these we note immediately that, quote, the Arab, unquote, or, quote, Arabs, unquote, have an aura of apartness, definiteness, and collective self-consistency, such as to wipe out any traces of individual Arabs with narratable life histories, stop, unquote. Post-colonial reading. Reading literature with the perspective of Orientalism in mind would make us, for instance, critically aware of how Yeats, in his two Byzantium poems, Sailing to Byzantium 1927 and Byzantium 1932, provides an image of Istanbul, the eastern capital of the former Roman Empire, which is identified with torpor, T-O-R-P-O-R, sensuality and exotic mysticism. At such moments, Yeats adopts an ethnocentric or Eurocentric perspective, seeing the East as an exotic other which becomes the contrasting foil to his own pursuits and concerns, all of which the poem presents as normative. Interestingly, Edward Said has written an essay on Yeats which reads him in the context of post-colonialism, reprinted in Said's Culture and Imperialism. Said views the desire, frequently expressed in Yeats' work, to regain contact with an earlier mythical nationalistic island as typical of writers whose own position is post-colonial, and this is closely related to Fanon's idea of the need to reclaim the past. Characteristically, post-colonial writers evoke or create a pre-colonial version of their own nation, rejecting the modern and the contemporary, which is tainted with the colonial status of their countries. Here, then, is the first characteristic of post-colonial criticism, an awareness of representations of the non-European as exotic or immortal other. Para. For Yeats, as often with the post-colonial writer, an uneasy attitude to the colonial language is evident. His injunction to Irish poets that they should learn their craft implies the need to serve a humble apprenticeship. This humble attitude to language may remind us, page 188, of Stephen Dedalus, D-E-D-A-L-U-S apostrophe S, thoughts about the English language in James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, published in serial form in 1914-1915, especially the early scene in which Stephen is patronized by an English priest because of his use of a local dialect word. Stephen tells himself, quote, "The language in which we are speaking is his before it is mine, ... My soul frets in the shadow of his language," unquote. Portrait, Chapter 5. More recently, the Irish poet Seamus, Seamus, Heaney, Heaney, in a poem entitled The Ministry of Fear, recalls his childhood unease and self-consciousness about his pronunciation of English. Quote, "Those hobnailed boots from beyond the mountain, / were walking, by God, all over the fine, / lawns of elocution," unquote, and remarks that, quote, "Ulster was British, but with no rights on, / the English lyric," unquote. See the collection North, 1975. This linguistic deference amounts to a sense that the linguistic furniture belongs to somebody else and therefore shouldn't be moved around without permission. Some post-colonial writers have concluded that the colonizer's language is permanently tainted and that to write in it involves a crucial acquiescence in colonial structures. Language itself, then, is a second area of concern in post-colonial criticism. For an essay on poetic language from this post-colonial perspective, see Stan Smith's Darkening English, Post-Imperial Contestations in the Language of Seamus Heaney and Derek Walcott's, in English, Spring 1994, para. As this implies, Yeats, being a member of the Protestant ruling class in Ireland, has a double identity as both colonizer and colonized, and it is the recognition of such double identities which is one of the strengths of the post-colonialist view. Thus, the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe, publishing his first novel, Things Fall Apart, in 1958, was criticized by an early reviewer for affecting to identify with African villagers when actually his university education and his broadcasting job in the capital city of Lagos should make him identify, it was implied, with the values of civilization supposedly brought to Africa by Europeans. See Echebe's paper, Colonialist Criticism, in Literature in the Modern World, edited by Dennis Wilder, Oxford University Press, 1990. This emphasis on identity as doubled or hybrid or unstable is a third characteristic of the post-colonial approach. Para. At one level, Echebe's use of a village Africa corresponds to Yeats's evocation of a pre-colonial mythological Ireland of heroes and heroines, page 189. At another level, the double or hybrid identity is precisely what the post-colonial situation brings into being. The shift in attitudes in the 1980s and 1990s was towards post-colonial writers seeing themselves as using primarily African or Asian forms supplemented with European-derived influences rather than as working primarily within European genres like the novel and merely adding to them a degree of exotic Africanization. All post-colonial literatures, it might be said, seem to make this transition. They begin with an unquestioning acceptance of the authority of European models, especially in the novel, and with the ambition of writing works that will be masterpieces entirely in this tradition. This can be called the ADOPT phase of colonial literature, since the writer's ambition is to adopt the forms as it stands, the assumption being that it has universal validity. The second stage can be called the ADAPT phase, since it aims to adapt the European form to African subject matter thus assuming partial rights of intervention in the genre. In the final phase, there is, so to speak, a declaration of cultural independence whereby African writers remake the form to their own specification without reference to European norms. This might be called the adept phase, since its characteristic is the assumption that the colonial writer is an independent adept in the form, not a humble apprentice as in the first phase, or a mere license as in the second. This stress on cross-cultural interactions is a fourth characteristic of post-colonialist criticism. Para. This notion of the double or divided or fluid identity, which is characteristic of the post-colonial writer, explains the great attraction which post-structuralism and deconstruction have proved to be for the post-colonial critic. Post-structuralism is centrally concerned to show the fluid and unstable nature of personal and gender identity, the shifting, polyvalent, polyvalent, polyvalent within quote, contradictory currents of signification within texts, and the way literature itself is a site on which ideological struggles are acted out. This mindset is admirably suited to expressing the numerous contradictions and multiple allegiances of which the post-colonial writer and critic is constantly aware. This post-structuralist perspective is seen in the work of such representative figures as Henry Louis Gates Jr., Gayatri Spivak, and Homi Bhabha. In all three of these, a complex Derridan, Foucauldian notion of textuality and fields of discourse is immediately apparent. Page 190. Similarly, in all three, the surface of the writing is difficult, and the route through to any consequent political action or stance even is necessarily indirect. This kind of post-colonial criticism roughly corresponds then to the theoreticized French feminist criticism associated with figures like Julia Kristeva or Helen Sixtus. The example of post-colonial criticism offered later is from the work of Edward Said, who is less overtly theoretical, seems to accept some of the premises of liberal humanism and has a more upfront political affiliation, his identification with the Palestinian Arab cause. His work is in this regard reminiscent of the Anglo-American variety of feminist criticism, which likewise seems to me more overtly political and certainly more immediately accessible. Para. If the three stages mentioned earlier, adopt, adapt, and adept, provide a way of seeing post-colonial literature, then a way of seeing the stages of post-colonial criticism would be to suggest, as we have just been doing, that they closely parallel the developmental stages of feminist criticism. In its earliest phase, which is to say before it was known as such, post-colonial criticism took as its main subject matter white representations of colonial countries and criticized these for their limitations and their bias. Thus, critics would discuss the representation of Africa in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, or of India in E.M. Forster's A Passage to India, or of Algeria in Albert Camus' The Outsider. This corresponds to the early 1970s phase of feminist criticism, when the subject matter was the representation of women by male novelists like D.H. Lawrence or Henry Miller. The classic instance is Kate Millett's Sexual Politics. The second phase of post-colonial criticism involved a turn towards explorations of themselves and their society by post-colonial writers. At this stage, the celebration and exploration of diversity, hybridity, and difference become central. This is the stage when, in the title of the well-known pioneering work in this field, The Empire Writes Back, This corresponds to the gynotext phase of feminist criticism, when there is a turn towards the exploration of female experience and identities in books by women. The analogy between these two types of criticism might be pushed a little further, so that a parallel might also be perceived with the split in feminist criticism between theoretical and empirical versions as suggested above. Thus, in postcolonial criticism, we might see a split between very directly influenced, page 191, by deconstruction and post-structuralism, such as the work of Homi Bhabha and work like Syed's, which accepts a good deal from liberal humanism, is written in a more accessible way and seems perhaps to lend itself more directly to political engagement.